June 1944. The beaches of Normandy were soaked in blood and salt water, and the air smelled like burning metal and wet sand. Allied forces had just stormed the coastline in the largest sea invasion the world had ever seen. Over 150,000 soldiers had crossed the English Channel in a single day. And in the chaos that followed, tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves with their hands in the air, surrendering to an enemy they had been told was weak and nearly defeated. Among them was a young Wehrmacht soldier, barely 22 years old, with hollow cheeks and dirt caked under his fingernails. He had not eaten a proper meal in nearly 5 days. His unit had been surviving on thin soup made from turnips and stale crusts of dark bread that crumbled like sawdust between his teeth. But the supply trucks had stopped coming weeks ago. His officers told them to hold the line, that victory was close, that the Reich would never fall. But standing on that beach with his rifle in the sand and his stomach twisted in knots, none of that felt true anymore. He was loaded onto a transport ship along with hundreds of other prisoners. The hold of the vessel was dark and damp, and the men sat shoulder to shoulder in silence. Some of them trembled, some fixed their gaze on the floor with blank eyes. A few whispered prayers. No one knew where they were going. No one knew what the British would do to them when they arrived. The ship crossed the channel and docked somewhere along the southern coast of England. The prisoners were marched off in long lines, their boots dragging against the gravel. Armed guards walked alongside them, but they did not shout or strike anyone. They pointed and gave calm instructions. The young soldier kept his head down and followed the man in front of him. They arrived at a processing camp surrounded by barbed wire and wooden guard towers. The camp held nearly 3,000 men already, and more were arriving every day. Camps like this one were filling up fast, with thousands of new prisoners arriving every week. But none of that mattered to the young soldier in that moment. All he could think about was the sharp, gnawing ache in his belly. Then something happened that he would never forget. A British officer handed him a ration tin. Inside was a thick portion of meat, a generous slab of bread, a square of margarine, a spoonful of jam, and a small packet of tea with real sugar. The young soldier stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned to the prisoner beside him and whispered, "Are we meant to share this for a week?" The other man shrugged, just as confused. A nearby guard overheard and shook his head with a slight grin. That was one man's ration, for one single day. The young soldier looked down at the tin again, his jaw clenched. Back home, his own army had not fed him this well in months. And here he was, a captured man on foreign soil, holding more food than he had seen in days. A single thought pressed against his ribs like a bruise. If this is how the enemy feeds its prisoners, what does that say about the people who sent us to starve? The meals kept coming. That was the part he could not wrap his mind around. Every single morning a bell rang, and the men lined up in the mess hall. Porridge with milk, soft bread with real butter, the stewed meat with potatoes and carrots for lunch, soup with thick vegetables for dinner, and always, without fail, tea. Hot, sweet tea with a spoonful of sugar. The British, it seemed, believed tea could fix just about anything. And for a man who had been starving just weeks before, maybe it could. Every day, between 2,000 and 2,500 calories landed on each prisoner's plate. Back on the German front lines, rations had dropped to 1,500 or less, and even that was never guaranteed. Here, food arrived like clockwork. Within weeks, the young soldier's body stopped aching. He was no longer hungry. Then the Red Cross parcels arrived. A truck pulled through the camp gates carrying wooden crates stamped with red crosses on white backgrounds. Many of the packages came from Canada, are packed by volunteers in cities like Toronto and Montreal. The Canadian Red Cross was one of the largest contributors to the over 16 million food parcels shipped by the Allies during the war, and each one was a small miracle. Inside were tinned meat, powdered milk, crackers, a bar of chocolate, a small tin of coffee, and a pack of cigarettes. One soldier held up a chocolate bar and laughed out loud. He had not tasted chocolate in over 2 years. The young soldier turned the parcel over in his hands and read the label. A country he had barely thought about thousands of miles across the ocean had packed this box for a man they would never meet. Not all the prisoners welcomed the change. A group of hardline soldiers near the back of the barracks watched the men who smiled too much, who thanked the guards, who seemed too comfortable. And but one evening, an older corporal with a deep scar across his jaw leaned in close and muttered, "You eat their food and forget what you are. That is how they win." The young soldier turned away and said nothing. He lay on his bunk that night staring at the ceiling and wondered if accepting kindness from the enemy made him a traitor, or just a man who was tired of fighting what felt true. Weeks passed, and some of the prisoners were assigned to work outside the camp. The young soldier was sent to a farm in the English countryside. The farmer was a quiet man with rough hands and a kind face. He showed the soldier what to do and worked beside him without saying much. At the end of the first day, the farmer's wife brought out a tray with cups of tea and slices of cake. She set it down on a wooden bench and nodded at him to sit. He was the enemy, and yet here was this woman, offering him cake as if none of that mattered. He noticed other things too. The roads were paved and smooth, the trains ran on time, the towns had not been bombed to dust, shops were open, children walked to school. Britain was rationing food and fuel just like everyone else, and yet life still moved forward in an orderly way. This was not the broken, desperate country his officers had described, and for the first time, a thought crept into the back of his mind that he could no longer push away. What if everything they told us was a lie? And then Christmas came, and it broke him open entirely. It was December 1944. The war was still raging across Europe, but inside the camp, something unexpected was happening. The British guards allowed the prisoners to organize a small celebration. A few men hung paper decorations on the mess hall walls. Someone fashioned a small star out of scrap metal and placed it on a wooden post in the corner. It was not much, but it was theirs. And then the food arrived. Roast meat, carved and steaming. Potatoes browned in fat. Cooked vegetables piled high on metal trays. A thick pudding for dessert with a drizzle of sweet sauce on top. Each man received a full plate. Some received seconds. A few of the guards stood near the door and nodded as the men sat down to eat. One guard raised his tin cup in a quiet toast. No one cheered, no one made a speech, but the room was warm, and for a few hours, the war felt very far away. The young soldier sat at the end of a long table and looked down at his plate. His throat tightened. He thought of the Christmas before, and spent in a frozen trench somewhere in the east, chewing on a piece of hard bread with numb fingers. He thought of the propaganda posters back home that showed the British as cruel and heartless, a dying empire on its knees. And yet, here they were, feeding their prisoners a holiday meal with real meat and real pudding, while their own citizens were living under the same strict rations. They were not doing this to show off. They were doing it because they believed it was the right thing to do. That thought hit him harder than any bullet ever had. In the weeks that followed, the camp began offering classes. Prisoners could attend lectures on history, politics, and democratic ideas. Newspapers printed in German were handed out so the men could read about what was truly happening in the war. The young soldier read every page, and he read about how Britain had held the line alone in 1940 when the rest of Europe had fallen. How ordinary men from mill towns and mining villages had crossed oceans and deserts to fight a war they refused to lose. He read about the liberation of the concentration camps, the ones where people were not prisoners of war but something far worse. His hands trembled as he folded the paper shut. The Reich had not just lied about the enemy, it had lied about everything. British authorities had begun screening prisoners into 3 groups. White meant the man was clearly against the Nazi party. Grey meant he held no strong views either way. Black meant he was still a committed believer. When the young soldier had first arrived, he would have been grey. Now, after the meals and the kindness and the newspapers and the Christmas pudding, he was white. He thought of the corporal who had warned him that eating British food meant forgetting who he was. But the corporal had it backwards. He had not forgotten who he was. He was remembering. The world he had been taught to believe in was not real. And the people his government had called monsters had shown him more dignity than his own country ever had. The war ended in May 1945, but the young soldier did not go home right away. None of them did. There were too many prisoners and too few ships and trains to move them all at once. So he stayed in the camp through the summer and into the fall. Some men grew restless and angry. Others sank into silence. But the young soldier did something different. He volunteered to keep working on the farm. The farmer welcomed him back without hesitation. But something had shifted, or they no longer worked in silence. The farmer pointed at things and said the English words. The soldier repeated them: plough, barley, rain. The farmer's daughter, who had once hidden behind the fence, now ran up and handed him wildflowers she had picked from the hedgerow. One afternoon, the farmer sat beside him on the bench during a break, poured 2 cups of tea, and said something the soldier had never heard directed at him before. He called him by his first name. Not prisoner, not German, just his name. And somewhere in that small, ordinary moment, the young soldier understood that he was no longer being treated as an enemy. He was being treated as a man. By late 1948, the repatriation process was finally nearing its end. Over 400,000 German prisoners had passed through British camps, and roughly 25,000 of them chose to stay in Britain a little longer, many of them working on farms just like his. But eventually, the day came. He packed his few belongings into a small bag. The farmer shook his hand firmly and said something in English that he did not fully understand, but the meaning was clear enough. The farmer's wife pressed a small wrapped parcel of biscuits into his hands. He nodded and walked away without looking back, because he knew if he turned around, he might not leave at all. The train carried him across France and into Germany. He stared out the window as the landscape changed. The green fields gave way to grey rubble. Entire cities had been flattened. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. The streets were filled with dust and silence. Women and children lined up at ration stations, their faces gaunt and tired. He stepped off the train in what was left of his hometown and stood very still for a long time. This was what defeat looked like. Not surrender on a beach, not barbed wire around a camp. This, the absence of everything. He carried no medals and no weapons. He carried no bitterness either. What he brought home was quieter than that. It was the memory of a ration tin that held more food than his own army had given him in a week. It was a Christmas pudding served by guards who did not have to be kind, but chose to be. It was a cardboard box packed by Canadian volunteers who would never know his name, shipped across an ocean just so a stranger would not go hungry. And it was a farmer's wife who set down a cup of tea in front of a man her country was at war with, but simply because she believed he deserved it. Years later, when his grandchildren asked him what the war had taught him, he sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said, "I went to Britain as a soldier of the Reich. I came home as a man who finally understood that a country's true strength is not measured by its weapons. It is measured by how it treats those it has every reason to hate."